Iran spent decades building an image of economic resilience. Officials repeatedly stated that external restrictions, sanctions, and international pressure would never be enough to destabilize the country's strategic system. For years, the focus remained on military capabilities, regional influence, and geopolitical positioning. But by the spring of 2026, attention across global markets suddenly shifted toward a completely different issue: energy logistics. What is unfolding now is not simply another political dispute in the Middle East. Analysts increasingly describe it as one of the most significant energy disruptions seen in the region in many years. And according to multiple international reports, the central issue is no longer military positioning itself, but the pressure building inside Iran's oil export infrastructure. Dear viewers, you are on the channel Info Vector. With you is Daniel Brooks, and we are moving on to our analytical review. The key problem revolves around storage capacity. Several major energy monitoring groups reported that Iranian oil storage facilities are approaching critical operational limits. Estimates discussed in international financial media suggest that available unused capacity may only remain for a limited period if export flows continue to slow. This situation developed after maritime restrictions and heightened naval monitoring began affecting tanker movement across major regional routes. According to data referenced by energy tracking firms, Iranian crude exports reportedly declined sharply within several weeks. Before these developments intensified, exports were estimated at close to 2 million barrels per day. Later, assessments suggested the figure had fallen significantly. For energy markets, the concern is not simply the reduction itself. The deeper concern is what happens when production systems continue operating while export channels become increasingly constrained. Oil infrastructure is designed around constant movement. Crude is extracted, transported, loaded, and shipped continuously. When that chain slows down, storage systems begin filling rapidly. Several analysts explain that if storage facilities approach full capacity, producers may eventually be forced to reduce output even further. That possibility has become one of the central discussions inside the global energy sector. At the same time, international financial institutions have also discussed the longer-term risks connected to sudden production interruptions. Energy specialists note that some oil fields can experience technical complications if production is reduced too quickly or under emergency conditions. Certain reservoir systems are highly sensitive to pressure changes, and restoring previous output levels later may become increasingly difficult. This is why many observers now argue that the current situation extends far beyond short-term market volatility. Some of the effects being discussed could potentially influence production capacity for years rather than weeks. One of the most closely watched locations in this entire story is the port of Chabahar. For years, Chabahar was presented as a strategic alternative route capable of reducing dependence on the Strait of Hormuz. The project attracted major international interest, including investment discussions involving India and broader regional transport initiatives connected to Eurasian trade corridors. But recent reports suggest activity around the port has changed dramatically. International shipping observers described growing congestion involving tankers and cargo vessels waiting offshore. Multiple publications also reported that some regional logistics plans connected to Chabahar are now being reassessed. India's role has become especially important in these discussions. Analysts point out that Indian investment helped give Chabahar much of its long-term strategic relevance. However, several reports now indicate that operational attention is increasingly shifting toward alternative Gulf infrastructure projects outside Iran. At the same time, developments involving the United Arab Emirates created another major conversation across oil markets. The UAE's growing export capacity through Fujairah is now being viewed as one of the most important balancing mechanisms inside the region. The Habshan-Fujairah pipeline allows oil exports to move directly toward the Gulf of Oman without relying on the Strait of Hormuz itself. Since the latest regional disruptions began, export activity connected to Fujairah reportedly increased substantially. Energy analysts say this infrastructure changes the strategic equations significantly. For years, global markets viewed Hormuz as an irreplaceable pressure point. but the expansion of alternative export corridors now complicates that assumption. This does not mean Hormuz has lost importance. Far from it. The strait remains one of the world's most sensitive energy transit zones. However, the existence of additional routes reduces the level of leverage any single disruption can create. The wider impact on OPEC is also becoming part of the discussion. Several market analysts noted that changes in regional production strategy may weaken the organization's ability to stabilize prices as effectively as before. If additional oil reaches the market while Iranian exports remain constrained, pressure on prices could increase further. For Tehran, this creates a particularly difficult combination. Lower export volumes combined with weaker pricing conditions place additional strain on state revenues at the exact moment when economic stability is already under pressure. Inside Iran itself, reports about growing economic stress continue to attract international attention. Foreign media outlets discussed internal assessments suggesting concern about inflation, employment, and rising costs of basic goods. Internet restrictions imposed during the recent crisis have also produced significant economic side effects. Millions of people connected to online businesses, digital commerce, and private services have reportedly experienced growing financial pressure as connectivity disruptions continue. For younger generations, especially, the digital economy had become one of the few sectors capable of functioning relatively independently from traditional state structures. Restrictions affecting that system therefore carry consequences far beyond communication alone. Public appeals by Iranian officials urging citizens to conserve electricity and reduce household consumption have further reinforced the perception that the country is facing mounting internal pressure. International analysts increasingly argue that the broader regional influence network connected to Tehran may also face financial complications if oil revenues remain limited for an extended period. Many regional organizations and allied structures depend heavily on long-term financial support. If energy revenues continue declining, maintaining those commitments could become significantly more difficult over time. Meanwhile, global energy traders continue monitoring every new signal coming from the region. Oil prices remain highly sensitive to any indication of escalation or diplomatic movement. Several possible scenarios are now being discussed openly. The first involves renewed negotiations that could gradually reduce maritime restrictions and stabilize export flows. The second scenario assumes the current pressure environment continues for an extended period, increasing economic strain inside Iran while global markets adapt around alternative supply routes. The third scenario, the one energy markets fear most, involves broader regional escalation affecting additional infrastructure across the Gulf. None of these outcomes would remain limited to the Middle East alone. The consequences would affect shipping costs, inflation, fuel prices, investment flows, and international trade routes simultaneously. That is why the current situation is being tracked not only by governments, but also by financial institutions, commodity traders, shipping companies, and central banks around the world. What makes this moment especially important is the realization that energy infrastructure can become just as strategically significant as military positioning itself. Pipelines, ports, storage facilities, tanker routes, and export terminals are now shaping geopolitical calculations in real time. And according to many observers, the pressure building inside Iran's energy system may ultimately become one of the defining economic stories of 2026. The next several weeks could determine whether the region moves towards stabilization, prolonged economic pressure, or a wider restructuring of global energy logistics. For now, the numbers themselves remain the central focus. Export capacity, storage levels, tanker movement, and oil pricing are no longer just technical indicators. They have become part of a much larger geopolitical equation that continues evolving day by day. And until those indicators begin stabilizing, uncertainty across the global energy market is likely to remain extremely high. But the bigger question now is whether this pressure campaign can actually reshape the long-term balance of energy influence across the Middle East. Could alternative export corridors permanently reduce the strategic importance of the Strait of Hormuz? And if Iran's energy infrastructure continues facing prolonged restrictions, how dramatically could that change the wider geopolitical landscape over the next several years? This was Daniel Brooks. See you in the next Analytical Reviews.